Today, we're talking about face-to-face communication and why it is so important. And joining me today is Dr. Sarah Tracy. So let's get into the details. Hey there, welcome back. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Sarah J. Tracy, a good friend of mine. She's a professor at Arizona State University. She also does speaking and workshops on relationship and connection. So Sarah, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm great. Great to be here, Alex.
I'm so glad to have you on. So let's just jump right in. The first question is, there's a lot going on in people's lives today that make the issue of face-to-face conversation that much more important. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on today that makes this so critical?
Yeah, some of the leading experts actually suggest that we are experiencing an epidemic of loneliness in the United States, and that disconnection, rise of social media, and a decrease of embodied conversation has something to do with that. Also is increasing communication anxiety. Third of all, people are losing the ability to empathically connect with one another, to actually be able to do perspective taking and see other people's points of view.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. It seems like we were talking the other day how it's twofold. We're doing less conversation, and so we're losing that time building relationships, but also since we're
Right.
not doing it, we don't have the skills anymore, so that when we actually are face-to-face, we just don't do it very well. We don't handle it very well. So what's going on today? What are the contributing factors to us losing that ability to connect?
Yeah. One of the things that you pointed to, Alex, is just this decrease in practice in
Mhm.
having face-to-face conversations. When you and I were young, we had the family phone, and even these sort of inane small conversations of, hello, Tracy residence, this is Sarah speaking, and making small talk with our parents' friends, my brother's friends, etc., gave us that daily practice. And people are wearing more and more ear pods, looking at their phones and so on. So whereas we might have passed the time in an airport or in public transportation having these conversations with strangers, we're more likely to be engrossed in our own mediated communication with people we already know or are connected to.
Right. Yeah, we're just losing that ability. People get so nervous just to have a common conversation, to just ask a stranger a question, like if they're in an unfamiliar part of town, or just say
Yeah.
hello to them in passing. So we are involved in texting, in social media, clearly lots of email, and we're on those a lot. And yet they're not really that good at building these genuine connections. Why is that?
Well, people go to social media intending to connect. However, the research shows that we actually feel worse after being on social media. The average per day, by the way, 2.5 hours a day that we spend on
Yeah,
social media.
it's
So
crazy.
obviously we're craving that connection. But the thing is on social media, we're more likely to come across these sort of photoshopped pictures. I
Hmm.
call it photoshopped lives. Some people have called it curated selves. Like we curate a museum, we curate our brand, our as a person, and so this ends up leaving us feeling like our lives in real life are not as great as our friend's life. And this social comparison is a happiness killer.
Yeah, you can feel it. If I'm on social media too long, I start to feel that sense of dissatisfaction, like, oh, I'm not going on any good vacations compared to everybody else. My life isn't as good. And
Right.
it's almost like we might go there, like you say, intending to connect, but then
Mhm.
instead we end up pushing out this personal brand. We're marketing
Mhm.
ourselves, a certain picture, a certain persona that we're pushing
Yeah.
out. So I can't really be authentic. I mean, I could in theory, but we don't see that much authenticity. You don't see people having a bad day and using social media to then feel better.
Yeah,
Uh,
the research actually shows that people use the emojis for negative emotions hardly at all compared
yeah.
to the positive emotions. And so, one of the downsides of that, too, is we really don't see when other people are suffering.
Hmm.
And we are most likely to reach out and connect to someone when we see that they are suffering. So, it's almost like, the suffering becomes invisible, and then that fuels the disconnection between people.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Like if you don't see it, it doesn't exist. And even if, and the other thing is sometimes you'll see someone maybe saying weird things, but you're not sure how to engage with it anyway on social media. Whereas if we were in person, you might sense the moment a little more. You could
Hmm.
pick up on small things and then speak into that. Now, I've been saying face-to-face conversation. You like the term embodied conversation. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, embodied, what I mean by that is that you have access to a number of different nonverbal cues. So ideally, right, that's face to face. So we're with our family, friends, we hear the burps, the farts, the giggles, the dirty diaper, the smell of the great food being made, and so on. And that gives us a sense of connection. But even when it cannot be face to face, it can still be embodied in some ways. Like you and I, we're able to see each other right now. I'm able to see if I say something and it doesn't hit exactly right by maybe a tone of or a facial expression. And even telephone, we know that the way somebody says something affects how we understand the message. And so knowing the tone of voice, is this sarcasm, is the person really excited, etc.
So why is it that embodied conversation is so important for our well-being?
Hmm. Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, if we are at all suffering, upset, or angry, there are likely to be a lot fewer misunderstandings when we have access to multiple nonverbal paravocalic cues. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the happiest people in the world are those that have the most social connections. And so
Hmm.
when we go running to our phone or social media, intending to think we're going to get that social connection, we could be better spending that time and we get more of a happiness boost if we were with people face to face. And when we see them face to face, we realize that they are whole human beings and they may have beautiful aspects to their life, but they're also suffering. And so we're less likely to do that social comparison as well.
Yeah, I also enjoy, this is a little off the thing, but when I'm with someone in the room, I can actually see how they react to other people. And so it helps me get to know them in a three-dimensional way compared
Yeah.
to just receiving a message over email.
Right. It goes from beyond dyadic and
Yeah.
these two little information things to this whole relationship, which includes a lot of people.
So what are the kinds of issues that are especially important to think about for face-to-face conversation?
Yeah. So whenever someone is suffering or upset, embodied conversations are much better than mediated
Hmm.
conversations. And that's because lots of times we don't know what to say, but even a facial expression or a hand on a shoulder or a pat on the back or a hug is going to show that we are with the other person. We acknowledge their suffering. Or if somebody is upset or angry, we can show that, oh gosh, I got it. Goodness, I got that you're angry. Because when people are upset, first of all, they need to feel acknowledged before they're going to take any information or advice and be willing to solve the
Mm,
problem.
right.
And so trying to mediate conflict over conflict over mediated communication is a
Right.
recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it doesn't work. I can't think of a single conversation over email or text that started bad and all of a sudden got better. It seems like we always read into it in exactly the wrong way. But
Yeah.
if you're face to face, you can sense their mood a little more. You can kind of tell
Mhm.
what's going on, and you hear it. I think closer to the way they may have intended it. So
Yeah, these
when
little micro expressions people are
right.
able to provide.
The
Yep.
tiny little things, they're hard to name, but you can feel it when you're
Yeah.
there. So when is it okay? When should we feel okay about using email and text and social media?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'm not saying that everything should be solved by embodied conversation. And whenever really the point of a communication is to deliver information, mediated communication is fantastic and can be much more efficient. In fact,
Mhm.
having meetings, for instance, that where everyone is together and it's just one report after
Oh,
another report, after
yeah.
sounds like you've been there. There's
Yes,
no
I've been
reason.
there.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you
So,
think, why are we even meeting? We could have just put an attachment on an email and this would have
right.
been done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you need to make decisions and collaborate, meetings are great ways to do that. But just information, email is fantastic.
Right. So we're talking about organizations a little bit in here in terms of meetings. And so
Mhm.
what can businesses, what can leaders do in the workplace to encourage more face-to-face conversation?
Yeah, well, more and more companies are realizing that their first thoughts of like, oh, we're going to make everything efficient through telecommuting and emails and so on, that it really does not always solve the problem. And so some companies are really going in a different direction, encouraging more people to come into work and designing what's called dialogic spaces. And dialogic spaces are those spaces where people that are specifically designed for people to come in embodied space with one another and create relationship. And that can happen in a ton of different ways. Some people are doing these sort of stand-up huddle desk for meetings where you don't
Mm,
sit down, you don't have enough room to have all your media out. Um, Cafeterias where people have to stand in line long enough to bump shoulders and engage in small talk, but not long enough maybe for them to pull out their phones, agendaless breakfast meetings, interactive company outings. At ASU, in terms of our mentoring, we actually have this activity that we call walk and talk. And it's a space where there's no agenda, but faculty and graduate students get together and go on a walk, hike, and talk. And so many creative ideas come out of that, and also a building of community and morale.
those are great ideas. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. Are you saying that bosses, organizations should force people to have face-to-face conversations?
Right, like forced family fun
Yeah,
time, right?
go have some fun
Well,
together.
yes, but in some ways, like they're definitely encouraged, but just designing for conversation does not automatically equate
Hmm.
with this interaction. There's going to be some people that still think, oh, the real work is me sitting down at my desk and returning emails. And as such,
Right.
it's really imperative that bosses, leaders embody themselves this sort of conversation. For instance, one idea would be having an hour a week where, you put a sign on your door that says free listening. And, free listening is someone comes in and doesn't have to have an agenda, and it's just listening in.
I love it. That's so great. There's so much to be said just for being there, just for being available and
Mhm.
listening and offering that connection and not having a task, a to-do list, some action items at the end, just to connect and build relationships. Then it seems like once you build that relationship, everything else gets easier anyway. So you end
Mhm.
up working together more effectively in the long run anyway. So
Yeah.
let's say you're not the boss, you're not a leader, you're not in charge. What can you do personally? What can we do, people
Yeah.
watching do personally to make sure they have more real connection with people?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things is just realizing that putting down our social media is hard. It is difficult because, in many ways, our social media is like a drug. Every time we get that buzzer beep, we get a quick dopamine hit. And it's almost like the gambler who it gets that dopamine hit, and you think, like, oh my gosh, this email I'm getting, it might finally be that email I was waiting
Yeah.
for to tell me I got this big award.
This is the email that's going to change everything.
Yeah, yeah, and usually it's another spam
Yeah.
risk or something like this. And but that dopamine hit is actually much different than the longer lasting serotonin lift we get
Hmm.
from social connections. But we've kind of got to go over that hump of like, okay, this is going to feel difficult in the short run, but it is actually better for my well-being. So that's
Right.
one thing, putting down our social media. And then also, just even if it's a few times a week or just starting small, choosing those video and phone conversations rather than the mediated connection. So if you have the choice between ordering pizza online versus calling, if you don't have a lot of practice in low risk situations. I like to also talk to strangers, and talking to strangers actually gives us a happiness lift.
Yeah.
One way I do this is in the elevator at school. And, oftentimes people have their ears with the ear pods and looking at their screen. And we may talk about something very inane, like, are
Hmm.
those Cheetos or Doritos on the floor of the elevator?
Right.
However, we end up leaving with a smile and kind of a connection. And oftentimes people are just pleasantly surprised, that somebody would be interested in chatting with them.
Yeah, it's sometimes those tiny moment. It almost takes a little bit of bravery, but then once the doors open, people are usually quite happy to have a nice conversation, even if it's brief. And then you have a few dozen nice conversations in a day or two, and now you're working in a nice place, right? You enjoy
Yeah.
going to work, and you
And
feel like you're part of
being
it.
okay with the awkwardness at first too,
Yeah.
right? So there might be some awkwardness, but that's the thing. It takes practice.
Right. Right. Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for being here. And just as a reminder for those of you who are watching, you can check out Sarah's content on sarahjtracy.com. She's, as I mentioned, a full professor at Arizona State University. She also has that website where you can find information about her classes, things like syllabi. She's got a blog and other resources, as well as a link to her YouTube channel. So, Sarah, thank you so much for being on the channel. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, everybody, and God bless, and we'll see you in the next video.